Governments in Africa are increasingly turning to digital economy and the digital modernization of tax systems, which is set to improve revenue collection. And across the continent, countries are embracing digital solutions to streamline tax processes, reduce fraud, and increase transparency. One example is Ghana, which recently launched its integrated tax application and processing system, a digital platform that allows taxpayers to file tax returns and make payments online. Now, this platform also provides real-time monitoring of tax collections, reducing the possibility of fraud and underreporting. So this morning, we want to look at the adoption of digital technology into tax administration for the African continent and see how useful it will be. And this morning, I'm being joined by Anthony Mwada, who's a tax administration and revenue risk management expert. He's joining us from Kampala, Uganda. It's nice to have you join us, Antonio, on the show.
Thank you very much. I am happy to be here with you.
Now, looking at Africa and bringing it into context, we see that just a little above 40% of internet penetration is what obtains on the continent. Now, isn't that a major challenge for African governments who are hoping to incorporate digital systems into the tax administration?
Well, of course, internet penetration is a great hindrance. On the African continent, penetration remains below 40%. 40% is really good. You will find that we have more mobile devices per capita, but most of the devices are not smart devices. So that limits the transfer of information, especially for tax purposes, and limits visibility of the revenue authorities to those people who are doing taxable transactions. So yes, the lack of internet depth is a limiting factor.
Are there other limiting factors that you want to consider? Because we see a situation whereby governments in Africa are hoping to improve on tax administration, widen the tax net, and see how they can generate more revenue. But then if they are hoping to make do with the machination of the use of digital technologies and the solution it provides, but then do not have the quality or adequate infrastructure to drive that challenge or to drive that conversation, rather, they will not be able to hit the target. So what other challenges would you consider that you think that needs to be addressed?
The availability of the infrastructure is one thing, but what has happened in Africa is that the landscape, the business landscape has changed very much in the last 10 to 15 years. You find that now people can do transactions on various platforms. Visa, now you can do transactions on Facebook, YouTube, and all these places. Now, the lack of internet depth and the skilled manpower to understand the touch point and the transaction chain from start to end, it limits the ability of revenue administrations to see where the business is happening. I will tell you that maybe up to 50% of tax administrations in Africa still cannot monitor in real time transactions done by Visa or credit cards. So that remains a hindrance to full visibility. So absence of technology is one thing, the skilled manpower is another thing, but also the rapid evolution of the business landscape is something that African governments are playing a catch-up game for.
So I'm talking about some rapid evolution of the landscape in Africa. I know that you are a tax administrator and you've worked with the likes of IMF, DFID, USAID, and WATAF, and the likes. Now, looking at the issue of technological advancement, as you've mentioned, do you think that it would be better for Africa tech-based companies to be domiciled in Africa to provide African solutions to the African narratives and the challenges that Africa is faced with than having these kind of technical or technological companies in other countries provide solutions for Africa? Because we're looking at how to bring about indigenous solutions from indigenous companies to solve African problems, as it were. So do you think that would be better, and do you think it's achievable?
Absolutely. It is achievable and it is better. In the international tax administration scope, we have a lot of assistance from Canada, especially from the United Kingdom and the US to a good extent. However, the solutions that have worked for them in their own environment are sometimes not applicable directly in the African environment. I'll take, for example, the large informal sector. Agriculture is largely informal. While it has a lot of return, it is not monitored. So we need to develop solutions which are tailored to our unique circumstances. You will find that many people give credit without a note. There's no record. So that money does not enter in the tax system. So we need to find a blend. A good example is that the Rwanda government has an agency which is now developing the tax administration solution for Chad, built on an African model which has been tried and tested in Rwanda. Now, when you import these other systems, you run a number of risks. The first one is that the cost of technology is very high. The cost of deploying these tax administration systems ranges upwards from $5 million up to maybe 10, 12. So that cost is a hindrance. Number two is that the developer of this system often remains with the soft copy ownership of that solution. So you're beholden to that person. So we need to build our own solutions, which we own, which we can edit and manage as and when we want to improve.
All right, so we are seeing that some African countries are already shining light in this conversation. We can talk about Ghana, as I mentioned earlier, that recently just launched its integrated tax application and processing system. And of course, we can also talk about Tanzania, that is said to be improving its tax systems by creating its own kind of tax-enabled technology, as it were. We could also mention South Africa, Kenya, Rwanda, as the case may be, and even recently Angola. So we're looking at how soon do you think this sort of penetration rate would be for Africa? Do you think that it will come at an accelerated process, or do you think that it will be a long way for us to achieve what we're talking about as regards harmonization and an efficient tax administration for Africa?
Thank you for that question. Let me digress a little bit. Africa's independence is threatened continuously by lack of ownership of these vital systems. Once these systems are owned by other people, then they will control how you transact, how you play the game. To give you an example, the East African community started in the late 60s and went through 1970s and so on. It had 3 countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. That system was so efficient that the European Union is actually modeled on the East African community. So we have done these things before, and they have worked. What we need to do is to come back to the drawing board and say, why should Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda have different tax administration systems to look at the same number of people, a market of 120 million people? It's the same kind of effective market as Ethiopia has with 90 million people. So we need to harmonize these systems. The systems need to speak to each other. Right in the middle there is something that African countries haven't done yet, which is called the automatic exchange of information. Again, Uganda and Kenya have an example where exports from Kenya and the imports from Uganda, they auto-reconcile through a system built locally. Now, the African people need to build such local reconciliation systems which help them to monitor each other's market. But when you have a foreign player who is a major player in the commerce of a particular country, when he comes in, he's going to dictate how you transact, how it is not efficient for the players. So we need to build our own solutions, and it has been done before.
All right. So now that you're saying that there's a need to build a synergizing or harmonizing of these kind of tax, digital tax-enabled systems for African tax administration, are we seeing, or are we approaching an era whereby we'll be coming to an end, seeing to an end of tax evasion, as it were, or irregularities in tax filing and, of course, tax collection? Are we getting to that point in Africa? And are you also saying that when we incorporate these digital systems into tax administration in Africa, it will make the system failure-proof?
Let me say it this way, that any revenue administration works using a risk management framework. You have a budget, you have a particular number of staff, and you have a government program. So what you want to do is to use your limited resources to reach as far as possible and collect as much tax as possible. That means you need to identify those 20% people who pay 80% of the tax as a beginning. And then you go and conduct intelligence to understand what other players are in the market, what should they pay, and then what is causing them not to pay. What are the drivers of compliance, of non-compliance? Who are the players? And then you start treating those. That is what the African governments should do. That is how an efficient revenue administration should work. You should collect the data, analyze it, and then you see where the non-compliance or non-performance is happening. I'll give you an example. You need to acquire specialized auditing skills. In the course of my work in the last 20 years, we saw that road construction companies were the biggest importers of fertilizer, and it was odd. But what we discovered is that when they use the fertilizer and add a propellant in the fertilizer, then they will create a bomb which they use to blast the stones which they use in the road construction. Now, you need to have collected enough intelligence to understand that link. Secondly, when we get our foreign partners, the non-African partners who come to build roads and bridges for us, we don't have the skills yet to understand the cost of developing these things. How wide is the road? What is cement? Because you're billing in cubic meters, but you don't understand how to convert bags of cement into cubic meters. So
okay.
We also need to
all right, Anthony, we probably might just end the conversation there and dwell on it some other time because we are pressed for time. But then we appreciate the fact that there's a need for digital infrastructure, there's a need for digital literacy and adequate analytical data for this tax database that we have for Africa. Thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.